Start, everyone. Thanks for coming for this either late afternoon or early evening event, depending on how you measure it. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the Vice President here at the Atlantic Council and the Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. And I'm really excited to welcome you to the Council today for what I have no doubt will be a very dynamic discussion on a very important but also controversial issue on the state of play of the Iran nuclear negotiations and what policy options the international community, in particular the United States, has for dealing with it. This discussion is part of a broader series in the Scowcroft Center this year on Gulf security. There's essentially a year-long project which has about 8 moving pieces, including some work on Middle East futures, on the geopolitics of energy, on NATO partnerships, new technologies in the Gulf, food, water, and energy security, and U.S. strategy for the region. And certainly in the context of the ongoing negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran on Iran's nuclear program, the Scowcroft Center has also been leading an effort to ascertain what happens if the international community fails. In other words, what type of world would be created were Iran to succeed in acquiring a nuclear weapons capability? What would be the nature of the implications for a new set of alliance arrangements, for a new set of military posture arrangements, et cetera? Much of the policy debate, I think, has rightly focused on how the international community can enhance its efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, including the cutting-edge work, I think, that's been undertaken here by the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center under the Iran Task Force. It's our sense that that work has had some notable impact on the administration's approaches, and we are certainly hoping that the deal gets done by the deadline and that we find a way forward on a diplomatic basis that resolves the concerns of all parties. Less attention has been given to the impact that an Iranian nuclear weapons capability might have on the global and regional security environment. That's why at the center we've had several workshops and meetings with experts and senior level officials on the implications of Iran's nuclear program, featuring experts like Dr. Kroenig here today, as well as Atlantic Council Senior Fellow Barbara Slavin, among others. Today's discussion is quite timely. The expert level talks between the P5+1 and Iranian technical experts have wrapped up in New York. The next round of senior level negotiations on a comprehensive deal, I'm told, will begin tomorrow in Vienna. Joining me today is Matt Kroenig. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Brent Scowcroft Center. He's a renowned expert on Iran's nuclear program, and he's the author of the book that is available today, A Time to Attack the Looming Iranian Nuclear Threat. Matt has served as a special advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he worked on defense policy and strategy for Iran in the Obama administration in the first term. He also served as a strategist in the Office of the Secretary of Defense about 9 years ago, where he authored the first ever U.S. government strategy for deterring terrorist networks. Dr. Kroenig's book, which will form the foundation of our discussion today, comes at a very important time. If not stopped, clearly a nuclear-capable Iran would be a game-changing event in the Middle East, potentially in the world, including the potential for a nuclear arms race in the region and an increased risk of war, among other major new challenges, which I'm hopeful that we'll discuss today. His book provides an in-depth analysis on the history of Iran's nuclear program, the international community's response to it, and what options might be available to policymakers. It also gets at the hard questions of Iran's nuclear ambitions and what the U.S. should do to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. His book has received bipartisan praise from the likes of Ambassador Dennis Ross, from Gideon Rose of Foreign Affairs, from Ambassador Eric Edelman, who called the book, quote, the most thorough book-length examination of the issues involved in assessing the Iranian challenge, clearly and engagingly written, A Time to Attack is a major contribution to the national debate on the issue and is a must-read for any and all who would venture to put forward an opinion on this vital topic. So I've been impressed with the bipartisan nature of the praise from Edelman as well as Ambassador Ross, who had a very senior position in the Obama administration, et cetera. So instead of me hearing myself talk, I'd like to turn it over to Matt. Thank you for coming. We do encourage tweeting. Please tweet to the Scowcroft Center account, which is at AC Scowcroft. And the hashtag for this event is the title of Matt's book, hashtag A Time to Attack. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kroenig. Thanks very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Barry. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here at the Atlantic Council, where I'm a relatively new non-resident senior fellow. And thanks to all of you for coming out. Finally have good weather in Washington, so I appreciate you spending the time in here in this dark conference room with me. So we're here today to talk about my new book, A Time to Attack, the Looming Iranian Nuclear Threat. And I think before I talk about what the book is, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about what the book is not. I think many people have preconceptions that are false, either because of the title of this book or of some of the other articles I've written. So the book is not arguing that the military option is our best option. It's not arguing that it should be our first option. Rather, the book argues that diplomacy is the best option, that if we can solve this problem diplomatically, that would be the best way forward. And everyone agrees with that issue. I think there's broad bipartisan consensus in this town that the best way to solve this would be diplomatically, if at all possible. So that's not even an interesting question. Everyone agrees we should solve the Iranian nuclear challenge diplomatically. The interesting question is what happens if diplomacy fails and we're forced to consider this difficult question of what is worse, nuclear-armed Iran or taking military action to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. So the argument of the book is that we should solve the problem diplomatically if at all possible, but if we get to this point of choosing between these two bad options, that a limited military strike on Iran's key nuclear facilities would be less bad than acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran and dealing with the challenges posed by a nuclear-armed Iran for decades to come. So that's the first point. It's not a military-first argument. Second, the argument of this book, at least in my view, is not controversial. This is U.S. policy. President Obama has stated many times that his policy is to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons through any means possible, even through the use of military force if necessary. This is a position that has broad support in the U.S. Senate. So I think there was a time when this argument was controversial. As Barry mentioned, I worked on Iran policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense back in 2010. That's when I first started coming to this conclusion. I made the argument publicly for the first time in a Foreign Affairs article in 2012. And at that time, the argument, I think, was genuinely controversial. Many of my colleagues disagreed with me in response pieces, in public debates. And I think it was controversial at that time because the U.S. government hadn't yet taken a clear stand on this issue. And you had many prominent people like Fareed Zakaria explicitly arguing that we should deter and contain a nuclear-armed Iran, that any kind of military action would be a disaster. So it was controversial at that time, but only a couple months later, in March 2012, President Obama came to my rescue and in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, staked out a position that was very similar to mine. He said that a nuclear-armed Iran was unacceptable, again, that he would do whatever it took to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons, and has given a number of subsequent statements, half a dozen or so over the past couple of years, has said not only that containment's not only our policy, he said containing a nuclear-armed Iran, or that a nuclear-armed Iran, quote, cannot be contained. So not that it's not only our policy, but it's not possible. Now you might just think this is political posturing, but the president's top advisors on this issue state matter-of-factly that the president's sincere in this view. So Dennis Ross, formerly the president's top Middle East advisor, Gary Seymour, formerly the president's top official on weapons of mass destruction, both state matter-of-factly that the president's willing to use force if that's what it takes to stop Iran. And then just last year, the United States Senate passed by a 99-0 vote resolution stating that our policy, we have a policy of prevention that will do what it takes to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. So essentially, I think what happened is that the conventional wisdom on this issue has done a near 180-degree turn in the past 2 years. And I think it's shifted so much to the point where people who suggest that deterrence and containment should be an option are now criticized as extremists. So Rand Paul got himself in some trouble a few weeks ago just by suggesting that deterring and containing a nuclear-armed Iran should be an option considered and took a lot of heat for that. So I think in short, the establishment position has kind of caught up to this position that I've been advocating for several years. So enough about what the book is not. What is the book about? Barry mentioned the very nice praise from Ambassador Edelman that this provides this is the most thorough book-length examination of the issues involved in assessing the Iranian nuclear challenge. And that's really what I aim to do when I set out to write this book. So as Barry mentioned, it looks at the history of Iran's nuclear program. It looks at all of the various policy options for addressing the Iranian nuclear issue, the pros and cons with those options, and then looks to the future and asks what the resolution of the Iranian nuclear challenge will mean for the future of international order. So it starts with the history going all the way back to the 1950s when Iran signed a peaceful nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States under the Atoms for Peace arrangement. It goes through all the way up to the present day, to the election of President Rouhani and the interim deal. I go through all the policy options, so I have a chapter on what I call the non-starters, the options that are not, in my view, real options. So many people argue that maybe we can sabotage, cyber attack, and assassinate our way out of this problem. I argue that that won't work. Many people argue that perhaps there's a Japan model type solution, that we can allow Iran to have an advanced nuclear program, one screwdriver's turn away from a nuclear bomb, kind of like Japan. I argue that that won't work. And some people argue that regime change is the option, that we just wait this regime out, some new government will come to power that will be more willing to deal on the nuclear program, and that will solve the problem for us. I also argue that that's not a good way forward. So the heart of the book focuses on what I see as the real policy options, the three main policy options: diplomacy, deterrence and containment, or military strikes. So the diplomacy chapter is actually the longest chapter in the book. So again, contrary to this notion that I give short shift to diplomacy or that I want to bomb tomorrow morning. So the diplomatic chapter talks about the history of diplomacy between the P5+1 and Iran, talks about the various diplomatic outcomes we could get in a comprehensive deal and the advantages and disadvantages of these different types of deals. And it talks about a diplomatic plan B, because if this current round of negotiations collapses, which, as I'll talk about in a minute, I think is still possible, then we wouldn't necessarily have to take immediate military action. It would depend on Iran's behavior. We could have up to another year or so before we would have to make tough decisions. And so I put forward a diplomatic plan B for how to get Iran back to the negotiating table and give this one last effort to solve the problem diplomatically. But I also argue that we have to be realistic. There's good reason to believe we won't get a deal this time around. President Obama himself says the chances of a comprehensive deal are, quote, no better than 50-50. There's been some optimism in recent weeks, but still there's a significant chance we won't get a comprehensive deal. And as I point out in the book, even if we get a comprehensive deal, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. The kind of comprehensive deal that's currently being pursued would leave Iran about 6 months from a nuclear breakout capability, according to Secretary Kerry. That's what he told a Senate panel a couple of weeks ago. Leaving Iran 6 months away from a nuclear breakout capability would mean the entire international community would need to remain laser focused on Iran to detect any possible cheating and respond to it essentially forever, at least as long as the deal remained in place. So getting a comprehensive deal doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. So if diplomacy breaks down, either because we don't get a comprehensive deal or because we get a comprehensive deal that unravels, then what comes next? So this is where you get to the difficult what is worse question. Again, what is worse, nuclear-armed Iran or taking military action to stop it? So to address this question, I have several chapters. I have a chapter on deterrence and containment. What are the threats posed by a nuclear-armed Iran? What are the policies the United States could put in place to deal with those threats? What are the limitations of those policies? And I have a separate chapter on military action. What are the various force packages by the United States and Israel that we could bring to bear? What are the advantages of doing that? What are the risks and the threats? And what is a strategy the United States could put in place to deal with those threats? And then I move on to the penultimate chapter, where I compare those two options side by side, because that's really the key question, I think, if diplomacy fails. Again, what is worse? So there are a number of ways you could tackle this question. The way that I tackle it is try to identify about a dozen key U.S. national security interests. The United States, of course, needs to protect the homeland. We'd like to prevent nuclear proliferation, combat international terrorism, maintain Middle Eastern stability, maintain the ability to access energy resources in the region, maintain U.S. freedom of action, burnish our reputation and our credibility. And so what I do in this chapter is look at all those national security interests and ask how they would be affected by each of these two outcomes. How would they be affected by a strike? How would they be affected by acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran? And what I show in the book and what you see as you go through that exercise is that there are many US national security interests that are clearly better protected by taking military action. Nuclear proliferation is one. There are several national security interests that appear to be pure toss-ups. Middle Eastern stability, for example. In the short term, clearly a strike would be worse for Middle Eastern stability. US strike, Iranian retaliation, potentially broader conflict. But over the long term, it's not so clear. Nuclear-armed Iran, many people assess, would be emboldened, could potentially lead to an arms race in the region, a destabilized region through nuclear crises in that sense. And so over time, I think there's a good argument to be made that regional stability would be less better protected by acquiescing. What becomes clear, though, is that there are no national security interests that are clearly better protected in both the short run and the long run by acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran and trying to deter and contain a nuclear-armed Iran. So I think when you go through that exercise, you see that if we get to that point, that a strike is the least bad option. Neither of these options are attractive, but a strike is less bad than simply acquiescing. So in this way, I think the book helps to explain the rationale of US approach to this problem, helps to explain the Obama administration decision to explicitly say that deterrence and containment is not an option, and they'll take action if necessary. So I think to finish up, I'll just tell a brief story. In 2006, I was in Singapore for a scenario planning conference. So this was a conference with journalists from, actually Brent Durbin here was in the room with me. I see Brent smiling. So you might remember this, Brent. So there were journalists, academics, policymakers from Europe, from Asia, from North America at the scenario planning conference. And we were talking about future states of the world, and the idea was meant to stress and strain our assumptions about the way the world works through the scenario planning exercise, and that we could bring those insights back into our day jobs. So one of the scenarios was about a future global financial crisis. Remember, this is 2006. And the scenario was a complete bust, because we had all of these intelligent people who followed international affairs closely, experts in economics and finance, and they said the scenario was just simply implausible, that there couldn't be another global financial crisis, that we learned our lessons in the Great Depression, that we had enlightened policies in place to deal with this kind of thing, that the world was different, it was globalized, it was interconnected. A global financial crisis couldn't happen. So they were willing to stretch their minds, but this was going too far. And then, of course, the Great Recession, global financial crisis, hit the very next year. And so as a specialist on nuclear proliferation, somebody who's studied this issue as an academic for the past 10 years, I'm afraid that we, the expert community and the general public, are at risk of being similarly Pollyannish about nuclear war. Are we really willing to bet international security? Are we really willing to bet the security of our country on the argument that something hasn't happened in 70 years, therefore it will never happen again? So I, for one, think that nuclear war, I would be surprised if there's not another use of nuclear weapons in my lifetime. And if Iran acquires nuclear weapons and it leads to an arms race in the Middle East, I think that would be one of the prime suspects for the next nuclear war, potentially even one that could result in a nuclear attack on the US homeland. So we often say that nuclear proliferation poses a grave threat to US national security. We often say it's one of the foremost threats to US national security. So if that's the case, we need to be able to do what it takes to stop it. Preventive strikes on nuclear facilities need to be one of our tools in our toolkit to stop the spread of the world's most dangerous weapons. And this is really consistent, I think, with the broad thrust of American foreign policy over the past half century or so, taking tough action to stop threats to international security that provided for peace and security of the world. And I think the Iranian nuclear challenge is no different, and now is not the time to shirk our responsibility. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt, for a very cogent presentation. I'm going to ask several questions that come to me from your presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the remainder of the time. I mean, the first question is the title, and I know some authors aren't thrilled with the titles that their publishers choose, but I mean, it strikes me as particularly provocative at a time when we're successfully getting out of, we've successfully, depending on how one defines that term, gotten out of the war in Iraq at great cost in blood and treasure for our country, and in particular for the military community that has borne the brunt of the war. We're still fighting in Afghanistan. Soldiers are fighting in, offering the greatest possible sacrifice to defend our national interests still there. This is a country that's really paid a dear price over the last decade or so, certainly since 9/11. And so the thought, I'd say right now, of even President Obama, even though he's made this statement that he will do everything possible to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran, just strikes me as extremely, ill-timed, if not sort of against the will of the American people. And so I just want to just ask you, are you that certain of the costs and risks of deterring a nuclear Iran that you would be willing to recommend to the Obama administration that they undertake a similar effort to prevent Iran from going nuclear?
Great, thanks, Barry. So you raise a number of issues. First, the title. So I meant to name the title in my opening remarks, but essentially I think a time to attack is appropriate because the argument is if diplomacy fails, then there will come a time to attack. So it's not time to attack tomorrow morning, it's a time to attack. And I think more broadly, too, is that, again, if we're serious about nuclear nonproliferation, then strikes on nuclear facilities need to be one of the tools in our toolkit. So when it comes to nonproliferation more broadly, in challenging cases, there comes a time to attack. On the question of timing, I mean, the question presumes to some degree that these difficult national security challenges, that we can schedule them to deal with them when it's convenient for us. And that would be nice, but I don't think that's the way the world works. Either we need to deal with these tough national security challenges at the appropriate time, or we can withdraw from the world. But I think that if we withdraw from the world and don't shape these important international developments to our interest, other actors will step in and shape those developments to their interest. And I think we're seeing the results of that in Syria, in the South China Sea, and the Ukraine. And so we often don't like the results. Yes, I agree that Iraq and Afghanistan, in many ways, those conflicts were ill-conceived and poorly executed. But I don't think the solution is that we made some mistakes, therefore we withdraw from the world. I think American leadership is important, and the Iranian nuclear threat President Obama has called it the, quote, leading security challenge of our time. And so I think getting this one right is important. Just because we made some mistakes, it's not time to back off. I think it's time to try harder. And in terms of the will of the American people, I think, if there's presidential leadership, I think the American people will support him. And if you look at the polls on this issue, and it depends a little bit on how you frame them, but I've seen some polls recently that are stated, if the president decides he needs to use force to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons, would you support him? And the vast majority of people say yes when phrased that way. So if there's presidential leadership on this issue, if he decides that this is the way he wants to go, I think the American people could understand this threat and support it.
Thanks. A couple other questions sort of on a military operation itself. I mean, it's certainly, you talked about how hard it is to predict events in the world, and certainly it's also hard to predict how any particular military operation might play out. It could get bogged down. There could be collateral damage. There could be any number of sort of untold consequences of a military strike, and even the political military consequences. Such an attack might further embolden Iran to strengthen its capacity for developing a nuclear weapons program, so it could pursue such a program more aggressively. There could be, Iran might lash out and launch retaliatory operations against U.S. forces in the Gulf, against Israel. They could be more aggressive sponsoring terrorist attacks in the United States, in Europe, or elsewhere. There's sort of a lot of potential, very direct and very unpredictable security consequences in a region that's already in turmoil from Arab protests and from the Syrian operation, from the Syrian conflict. Libya is sort of in a shambles, and so how do you sort of suggest that that the consequences, how are you able to weigh the consequences of a very unpredictable military operation itself, as well as sort of the unpredictable consequences of any military campaign on Iran's program, but also on the broader regional security questions?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and I think that all policy analysis really comes to trying to make your best assessment of two unknown states of the world. What is the state of the world if we implement this policy? What is the state of the world if we don't implement this policy? And that's true of every policy decision, whether it's healthcare, national security, anything. And so you never know. You make the best call that you can with the available information. And I think that this one, because the stakes are so high, nuclear-armed Iran on one side and all the threats that poses and all the downside risks of military action, is a particularly, that kind of dilemma comes into sharp relief. But I think it's the same for all really policy analysis and policy decisions. So you pointed out many downsides to a strike, and I think I would shade some of those things slightly differently, and you can read how I would shade them in the book. But rather than go through each one, I think I would just take a step back and say I fully agree that there are many risks and negative consequences of a strike, and I think all reasonable people understand that. The problem, of course, is that there are many risks and negative consequences of acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran. And then, so the points that you laid out of the negative consequences of a strike, I think, are about 1/4 of the analysis that you need to actually answer this question. The other quarter are what are the benefits of the strike, what are the potential positive outcomes in a deterrence and containment scenario, what are the negative consequences of a deterrence and containment scenario, and then how do you weigh those? So rather than doing that, I do it in the book, and so you can all read it. But I'll just tell a story that I also tell in the book. When I was working as an advisor on the Iran desk in 2010, I did a major briefing on this issue to senior military and defense officials. And the final slide in the briefing was a PowerPoint slide. Of course, defense officials love to get information in PowerPoint slides. So it was a PowerPoint slide with these different national security interests across these two different outcomes. And so national security interests that were improved in a particular scenario were colored green. Those that remained roughly neutral were colored yellow, and those that represented increased threats to the national security of the country were depicted in various shades of orange or red, depending on their severity. So everyone in the room noticed two things right away looking at these slides. First, there was very little green, a lot of orange and red. These are not good outcomes. That's why we should solve the problem diplomatically if at all possible. But the second thing that people noticed is that the nuclear-armed Iran side of the chart was noticeably darker than the military strike side of the chart. In this case, literally paled in comparison to the risks of taking military action. So fully agree that it's a bad option, but the question is, what is worse? And when you think about the potential negative consequences of living with a nuclear-armed Iran for decades to come, I think it's really hard to argue that a limited strike on Iran's nuclear facilities is not the least bad option.
So just to sort of go back at you, though, let's just take the first example that I used, that it wouldn't increase Iran's motivation to build a nuclear weapon. I mean, what's your sense? The ideal limited military campaign. What does your analysis suggest? How many years does that set Iran back? And do they not try even harder to overcome the diminished capacity that such a strike, that such a strike would engender?
Yeah. So for many people make this argument that a strike would actually be counterproductive, that it would simply make Iran want nuclear weapons more, that they would kick out IAEA inspectors, redouble their efforts, and quickly build nuclear weapons shortly thereafter. But I think that's misguided, and I kind of explain why in the book, because I think there are a number of bad assumptions and to make that point. I think it actually requires some quite tortured mental gymnastics to argue that a strike that destroys Iran's nuclear capability somehow puts it closer to a nuclear weapon. So let me just make a few points. First, it assumes that Iran hasn't already made the decision to build nuclear weapons. And as I argue in the book, I think that's wrong. I don't think that Iran is going to pursue nuclear weapons come hell or high water, no matter what. We've already seen that the sanctions have got them to the negotiating table and convinced them to put limits on their program as part of the interim deal. But I think it's clear that they've made the decision to build nuclear weapons, and that's what this program's aimed for. And I go through about kind of 14 different reasons why it's clear that they're trying to build nuclear weapons, and this isn't an energy program or anything else. And after all, the Supreme Leader has been building up this program for several decades. It would be kind of, I think, naive for us to assume that he hasn't thought long and hard about what he's doing and what he intends to do with this program. Second, if there is a concern that by striking we'd somehow make Iran want nuclear weapons more, that can be completely mitigated through the timing of the attack. And so that's what I talk about here. Again, I'm not arguing that we should bomb tomorrow, but rather that if Iran approaches what are the real red lines in the sense of if they cross them, we can no longer physically stop them from building nuclear weapons. And I argue that those should be, those are our practical military red lines, and those should also be our stated red lines. If they get to that point, then it's clear that they're dashing to nuclear weapons. If they're enriching to higher levels, if they kick out International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, it's clear that if we don't do anything, they will build nuclear weapons. So a strike at that point doesn't increase their motivation. Rather, standing by guarantees that they build nuclear weapons. A strike creates time and space for a non-nuclear outcome. In terms of how many years does it buy, that's difficult to know because it depends on so many assumptions about does Iran decide to rebuild? How quickly does it decide to rebuild? Is it able to access the material it still needs, still reliant on in the international marketplace to build its program? But the best estimates out there are that an Israeli strike would buy a year or two. A US strike would buy much more. You see anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7. But these are, it's important to point out, these are worst case scenarios. These are assessments based on the idea that Iran decides to rebuild its program immediately and doesn't encounter any significant opposition. So one of the things I do in the book is look back at the history of strikes on nuclear facilities historically. There have been 4 countries that have had their nuclear facilities bombed. Nazi Germany in World War II, Iran in the Iran-Iraq Wars, Iraq in the Iran-Iraq Wars, and then again several times by Israel and the United States, and Syria in 2007. So in all these cases, the strike set back the program, and then in every single case, politics and geopolitics that were completely unforeseen at the time intervened to prevent those countries from continuing their nuclear programs. So Nazi Germany lost World War II, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which led to the Persian Gulf War. Iran's decided to slowly rebuild its program, but here we are 30 years later and it still doesn't have nuclear weapons. Syria had a civil war break out and abandoned its program. And so in every case historically, the strike bought time for time and space that allowed other events to intervene that kept the country from building nuclear weapons. So I guess it's conceivable that a strike would cause Iran to double down and quickly rebuild nuclear weapons, but there's no historical precedent for that. Rather, what we've seen is that the strikes have bought time and space that have allowed for a non-nuclear outcome.
Thanks. I have so many more questions, but I'm only going to ask 2 more, and then we'll turn it over. Let's talk a little bit about the other sort of policy option we would have if negotiations did not succeed, and that is Iran acquires a nuclear weapons capability, at some level of acknowledgement or perception, whether they announce it or what have you. Why is that a world that's more dangerous than the unpredictable world of a military, in the aftermath of a sustained, although limited military strike? We have a history of talking about proliferance, and here I'm thinking of North Korea, where successive administrations said a nuclear North Korea is unacceptable, and here we are. Press reports indicate they have 6 to 12 nuclear weapons, and we're living with it. North Korea is not Iran, but that's one example that suggests that it's not. It might not be as difficult as you're suggesting. The other thing I think of is the work you did in the Pentagon on deterring terrorist networks, where a lot of people in the U.S. administration thought that was infeasible, but you proved that that to deter an actor, you need to threaten what they hold at risk. Threaten what they value by holding it at risk. And we can talk about the dynamics of deterrence. But so if everyone's deterrable, why would we not, undertake an effort with less sort of unpredictable risks and dangers? Not saying that's an ideal outcome, as you said. This is a question of the lesser of different evils. But tell us why containing and deterring a nuclear-capable Iran is a more dangerous world than one where you unleash the fury of United States military power with to me, very, very unpredictable outcomes and potential scenarios that might unfold from that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned North Korea, and I think if North Korea is a model for what a nuclear-armed Iran would look like, we should all be very concerned. Nuclear-armed North Korea has transferred sensitive nuclear technology to other states. Syria had a nuclear program because it got help from North Korea. North Korea has become more aggressive since it acquired a nuclear weapon. weapons, sunk a South Korean warship, has shelled a South Korean island, made nuclear threats against the United States just last year. And we haven't even seen the full ramifications of a nuclear-armed North Korea. As conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, so it's had nuclear weapons for less than 10 years. So we could still see a nuclear war involving North Korea. So I think if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, we would have to worry about all the same things. I think Iran would be a country that would be likely to transfer sensitive nuclear technology to other countries. So that would likely lead to further proliferation around the world. I think it would also lead to further proliferation around the region, and that's something we're seeing in North Korea. America's ability to reassure our allies in the region, reassure the South Koreans and the Japanese, is becoming much harder now that North Korea is nuclear armed. And I think Iran would be more aggressive. We know now that Iran restrains its foreign policy because it fears possible U.S. military action. If Iran had nuclear weapons, it would know that it could deter major U.S. or Israeli military action. I think that would encourage it to be more aggressive, step up its support to terrorist and proxy groups, engage in more coercive diplomacy in the region. And then also, I think again, there's a non-trivial risk of nuclear war. And I don't think that Iran's leaders are irrational. North Korea's leaders, maybe. That's another issue. But I don't think Iran's leaders are irrational. I think they want to survive. But rational states get into geopolitical competitions with their rivals. They engage in high-stakes nuclear crises. And in those crises, there's a real risk of nuclear war. So I don't think anybody would say America's leaders are irrational. But we got into all kinds of nuclear crises with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, came close to nuclear war several times. And I don't think a nuclear-armed Iran would be any different. I think it would get into high-stakes crises with Israel, with the United States, in the future with other nuclear-armed states in the region. And any one of those crises could spiral out of control. So I think it's a bad outcome. And on North Korea, Richard Haas said that in 1994, he was one of the people advocating for a strike on the Yongbyon reactor in North Korea, and said recently that he was right, that we should have struck the reactor at that time. If we had done that, we could have avoided all of the problems we've been dealing with North Korea for the past 10 years. So again, I think the North Korea example supports my argument. It doesn't undermine it. On terrorism, if terrorists are deterrable, why isn't Iran deterrable? I think Iran can be deterred from doing certain things. I think we can deter Iran from intentionally starting a nuclear war. Again, I don't think they're suicidal. I think they can be deterred from purposely transferring nuclear weapons to terrorist groups. But I think there are a lot of things that you can't deal with in a deterrence and containment scenario, and I talk about it in the deterrence and containment scenario in the book. I don't think you can deter Iran from transferring nuclear technology to other countries. Are we really going to be willing to go to war with Iran if it transfers uranium enrichment technology to Venezuela or Bolivia or some other country? Because that's what deterrence means at the end of the day. It means that you threaten retaliation against a country if they cross your red lines. So are we really willing to take military action against a nuclear-armed Iran for these various transgressions if we are unwilling to take military action against a non-nuclear Iran? And even if we are, who would believe that? Who would believe that after 3 consecutive presidents have said that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, we'll do whatever it takes to stop it, and we stand by as they build nuclear weapons, who's going to believe threats that we're willing to go to war with Iran if it transfers nuclear technology, sponsors major terrorist attacks, attacks our neighbors in the region? I think credibility is going to be one of the things that makes deterrence and containment of a nuclear-armed Iran very difficult.
Thanks, Matt. I think I have about 10 more questions, but I think it's time to open it up to others who've come here. Yes, Harlan.
I'm Harlan with Matt. Thank you. Let me start with an anecdote. You talked about the economic crisis.
1 second, you have a microphone working its way towards you.
It's interesting to know that credit default swaps, which were really at the heart of the crisis, were outlawed in 1908, a year after the 1907 financial panic, and then brought back 82 years later. We had the same arguments that you're making in the 1940s about the Soviet Union, almost explicitly, and of course with China in the 1960s. I just make that a historical fact. Supposing you were talking to National Security Advisor Pavel, and he said, I'm going to reverse the Cheney doctrine about 1%. Are you absolutely certain that Iran does not have nuclear weapons hidden away? Not 1%, but 0. And second, and I've been unfortunately in the targeting business for a long time, and I've worked with various CENTCOMs. If the only way that really we could guarantee setting back Iran's nuclear programs for a significant period, and I have, as Barry does, real doubts about what we can do, required nuclear weapons, would that change your attitude? And thirdly, the one chapter I would like to have seen in your book, if whatever happens, the president says, I cannot take the risk. We're going to allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. How can we make the best of a very, very bad situation?
Great. Well, thank you very much. So first, am I absolutely certain that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons? I'm probably not 100%, but I think I'm at least 99% plus certain that they don't, for a couple of reasons. One, our insight into Iran's nuclear program is very good. And I know people often say, well, we've been wrong so many times in the past. We thought Saddam Hussein was further than he was. We were surprised by how quickly the Soviet Union tested, by how quickly India tested, et cetera. But none of those countries were part of the, none of those countries had the kind of IAEA presence on the ground that we have now in Iran. So we have IAEA inspectors at all the Iranian nuclear facilities, visiting the major facilities daily now, writing these detailed reports. So I think we have very good insight into Iran's nuclear capabilities. And so that gives me some confidence that they don't have some secret program somewhere that we don't know about. Some other things, too, that I talk about in the book in terms of our ability to detect them in the past and other things. Well, I mean, that's a wild card. Or what if North Korea transferred highly enriched uranium to Iran or something? So this gets to the second point, and this comes more from my analysis of Iranian kind of strategic culture, which is the Iranians tend to, in this area, exaggerate their capabilities rather than downplay them and keep them hidden. So it would be, they've done this on drones, they've done this with their missile technology, they're always, with their Navy, they always kind of exaggerate what they can accomplish. So I'd be surprised if on this, the crown jewel of their security program, they were hiding back the secret capability. My sense is that they would rather, like Pakistan and other countries have done in the past, kind of suggest that they have the capability even before they actually have it. So fairly confident, but nothing's 100%. So I was talking about this issue with a colleague of mine a few weeks ago, and he said, what would lead you to a different assessment? What would have to change for you to decide that actually we should deter and contain a nuclear armed Iran? We can't take military action. And I think the answer, what I told him is the answer really depended on the ease of the operation, was a big part of it, and in terms of what Iran could do with retaliation. So right now, as I point out in the book, there are really 4 key facilities that are the choke points for Iran's program. We can destroy those using conventional military power. And so this isn't an Iraq and Afghanistan style operation. This is an operation where you invade the country, put in 100,000 troops, stay for 10 years. It's something that could be done in several hours. And of course, we don't know what the full range of consequences would be in terms of retaliation and other things. But if the operation were much more difficult for some reason, that we did have to do a ground invasion, we had to use nuclear weapons and break the nuclear taboo, then I think that would be a very different calculation. What if all this fails? What if diplomacy fails? What if military strikes fail and Iran builds nuclear weapons?
We decide not to use military force in Iran, goes ahead and develops a weapon. Can you see what sort of an opportunity could you make of that?
Yeah. Well, so I have an entire chapter on that scenario in the book, and one of the things I maybe didn't make clear enough in my opening remarks is I really tried to make this book of value to everyone, regardless of what you think the best policy is, regardless of your views coming in. So the deterrence and containment chapter I take very seriously and try to lay out all the threats, try to articulate as best as I can what our best strategy would be for dealing with that, and what the limitations of that are. So I think it's all there, and I think that if we were there, we would do our best to deal with it. We would do our best to deter and contain a nuclear-armed Iran. But again, just thinking about the various threats that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose, and we wouldn't be dealing with, this isn't a problem that we'd deal with for a week. It would potentially be as long as Iran had nuclear weapons and was hostile to the United States, which could be decades or longer. So when you just think about all those various threats over the course of those many years, I think it's a very bad outcome. But if we found ourselves in it, we would do our best to deal with it.
But no specific ideas, for example, a new treaty pact?
Oh yeah, so I go into this in the book. I think,
NATO for the Middle East or something?
yeah, I think we'd likely have to, because we'd want to deter Iran from attacking our partners and allies in the region, attacking U.S. bases in the region. And so I think we would have to make those security commitments firmer than they are today. So I think we would likely sign some kind of formal security guarantees with Gulf states, perhaps with Israel. I think it would require forward deploying U.S. forces in the region, even a heavier presence than we have today. potentially forward deploying U.S. nuclear weapons to make it very clear that the nuclear and conventional level are coupled, that Iran can't get away with a conventional attack without having the potential of nuclear retaliation on the table. So this becomes an expensive, long-term operation with a lot of risks. So yeah, I think many people think that you can say deterrence and containment and the job's done, but a real deterrence and containment strategy, as you know, as we had in place for Europe, as we had in place in East Asia, requires a lot of work, formal political commitments, and visible presence there to make those commitments credible.
Let me just hit the cost issue, even though it's not a life and limb question, but I think I saw an estimate that a limited campaign would cost $713 billion of this kind, and how does that compare to sort of your assessment and most experts' assessment of what's the nature of a more robust, what would be the cost of a more robust U.S. posture in the region to deal with a nuclear-armed Iran? Sort of, I think about it as sort of a mini Cold War, maybe not 60 years, but 30 or 20 or 10, and maybe not global, but certainly intensively in the region with offshoots in other regions. I mean, have you done that sort of comparison?
Yeah. Well, first, I guess let me say I'm doing renovations on my condo in D.C., and the contractor gave me some estimate at the beginning, and now it's very different at the end. So if it's that difficult to figure out how expensive it is to put in hardwood floors, I'm little. I wonder a little bit about our ability to give point estimates on how much these major operations cost in one way or another. But that said, I think a strike would be expensive in certain ways. But again, if you think about a deterrence and containment scenario, that would also be very expensive. Building new U.S. military infrastructure in the region, forces there, potentially nuclear weapons, potentially for, again, as long as this was a problem, which could be decades or longer. So this is a good opportunity actually to plug a project I'm doing here for Barry, doing a project on deterring and containing a nuclear-armed Iran. And one of the things I want to drill down into a little bit more is what is the potential economic cost here? And so working with some people who have a lot of experience on defense budgeting to try to price that out. One place where I think it's a little narrower slice and a little bit easier to get a handle on is on what is the economic damage on oil prices. Because many people have pointed out that a military strike would lead to spikes in oil prices because traders would fear possible supply disruptions, so bid up the price of oil. And if there was actually a supply disruption because Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz or other things, then that would actually take oil off the market, which would raise prices. And so oil traders have done various analyses of that scenario. One of the things I talk about in the book, though, and that's often overlooked, is that there are also oil price spikes if Iran acquires nuclear weapons. And so I do some analysis with Bob McNally, who's a leading oil analyst. And in that scenario, oil traders would not only have to worry about conventional conflict and closing the Strait of Hormuz, they would potentially have to worry about a nuclear war in the region, eliminating all oil supplies in the region, or at least taking it off the market for an extended period of time. And so that would lead to likely a worldwide economic recession. And so in each of these crises, then oil traders wouldn't just bid up, there's some risk that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be closed off. It's making some assessment of what's the likelihood that there's going to be a major reduction in oil supply. So the best estimates are, there's also a report done by the Bipartisan Policy Center, and they come to the same conclusion, that actually acquiescing to a nuclear-armed Iran leads to a higher risk premium in oil prices, and in the event of actual conflict leads to higher spikes in oil prices than military action. So military action leads to spikes in oil prices, but the spikes in a deterrence and containment scenario are likely worse. And just think, last year when Kim Jong-un was making nuclear threats against its neighbors, against the United States. I mean, imagine if it was not North Korea doing that, but Iran. Imagine what would happen to the global oil market. I think prices would be through the roof.
Thanks. I think we have a question in the corner.
Thank you. Diane Perlman. I'm at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason and a behavioral scientist. And I just got back from 2 weeks at the NPT PrepCom at the UN, actually, in which virtually all the delegates commended the negotiations with Iran. So people are happy that seems to be that's going on. I think there's a third way. I mean, diplomacies can be very limited, And I think there are other strategies that are more effective and creative, like mediation, negotiation, tension reduction, positive inducements. And if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I think there are more creative ways out. I call it like the political Heisenberg principle, that you can't observe an actor without looking at the effect of the observer. So the more coercive, punishing, threatening, humiliating we are, the more we increase the popularity of hardliners and increase the value and prestige of, and the desire to have nuclear weapons also to deter us. And also, all the countries, as always, are, complaining about us not complying with Article 6, that the nuclear weapon states didn't negotiate in good faith to eliminate our nuclear weapons. And the other thing about North Korea, that when Clinton was president, there was a sunshine policy, and we were negotiating with them to give them weed and to launch their satellites. So there was a different path that switched. So you can't just look at North Korea now without looking at it could have gone another way if we behave differently. So just throw that out. I'd like your response.
Yeah, I think when you think about diplomacy and trying to influence the actor of other states, there's kind of the classic carrots and sticks approach. You can promise carrots and benefits, inducements, as you termed it, if they go in a direction that you find attractive, and threaten sticks or punishments if they go in a way that you don't like. And so, I think.
I don't think carrots and sticks are the same. They're both external forms of reward and punishment. I'm not talking about both carrots. I'm not talking about just carrots. I'm talking about a completely different, analyzing the underlying conflict. Like just legitimate goals, just grievances. Mm-hmm. It's different than carrots and sticks altogether.
Yeah, okay. Well, so you use the term inducement, so I thought you were going in that direction. But if looking at the underlying driving forces, then I think there are real underlying driving forces pushing Iran in this direction. They are in a dangerous neighborhood. And if you look at their stated goals, Iran's explicitly stated goals are to protect the theocratic regime, to be able to deter foreign attack, and to become the most dominant state in the Middle East. And so if those are your goals, having nuclear weapons makes a lot of sense. Having nuclear weapons allows you to deter foreign attack. It protects the regime. It allows you to become the most dominant state in the Middle East. Having a nuclear energy program doesn't give you any of those things. So I think given Iran's goals, pursuing nuclear weapons makes a lot of sense. But if you're anyone else, if you're states in the region, if you're the United States, then an Iran armed with nuclear weapons creates a lot of problems. So I think this is really kind of a zero-sum game here, and I think that's why the negotiations are so difficult. What we want to achieve is an Iran with as limited nuclear capability as possible. They want to be as close to a nuclear weapons breakout capability, if not a nuclear armed state, as possible. And so it's really tough to get a breakthrough there. But I think that's what I see as the underlying driving force for Iran here. They want to be the most dominant state in the Middle East, and having nuclear weapons allows them to achieve that.
Great. Question right here.
Thank you for this. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to read it yet. But how much of this...
Want to identify yourself?
Oh, Mike Masedig of the Online News Hour.
Yep.
How much of this is based on the premise that for the first time in history, the Air Force will deliver on its promises for strategic bombing? Because every war we fought since World War II, they promise a lot, and then they go back and look at the results a few years later and find out that they haven't come anywhere near their promises. And I think, I'm not an expert on Iran, but I understand that one of their facilities is really, really deep underground. And so can strategic bombing just functionally work in this circumstance?
Yeah, good question. And this gets a little bit to the question, or my response to Harlan's question earlier, which is in terms of destroying the nuclear program, it's a relatively simple operation. There are 4 key facilities you need to get. 2 of the facilities are above ground, so those are easy targets for the United States or for Israel if they decided to go that route. The 2 enrichment facilities are underground, so those are a little bit more difficult. The Natanz facility is, I think, 75 feet of earth and a few meters of reinforced concrete. And the really hard one is Qom, the one built in the side of a mountain. That's under 295 feet of rock. But the United States has developed a new bunker-busting munition, essentially precisely for these sites, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb, Massive Ordnance Penetrator, sometimes abbreviated as the MOP. According to open source information, the MOP can penetrate 200 feet before exploding. So you can do some simple arithmetic that would go straight through Natanz, no problem. Qom is a little bit more difficult, but one thing you can do is actually put subsequent MOPs in the crater left from previous ones. A couple of, as I point out in the book, probably 2 Massive Ordnance Penetrators gets you into the enrichment chamber at Qom. So this is a relatively simple operation for the United States. For Israel, it's much more difficult. Israel could get the above-ground facilities, could possibly get Natanz with its bunker-busting bombs, but it doesn't have the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Rather, GBU-28 is its most advanced bunker-busting weapon. So potentially, if it, with multiple bunker busters in the same crater, could get Natanz, getting Qom is much more difficult.
I mean, can I just follow up? Because I think you're in some way setting yourself up by saying it's going to be a relatively simple military operation. Let's even assume that the part of the operation that you just described goes exactly as you just described, which never happens in the real world. Iran then retaliates with ballistic missiles against Qatar, against the UAE, against Saudi Arabia, against Israel, and possibly against our radars in Turkey. Then what? I mean, this doesn't strike me as a simple, clean or quick military operation. So how does that all play out?
Well, perhaps that wasn't the best word. But to be clear, I meant destroying these 4 key facilities is a matter of physics, and we can do it. That doesn't begin to get at the full scale of the full range of the conflict. I go into great detail in this in the book, and can't get into all of it here. But one, there's a question of what Iran can do, and Iran does have some threatening retaliatory options. Ballistic missiles could sponsor terrorist attacks, could harass and attack ships in the region. But then there's also a question of what would Iran do? And so put yourself in the shoes of the supreme leader. You've just had your nuclear facilities destroyed, but your regime's intact, your military's intact. What do you do in that situation? How do you retaliate? On one hand, you need to strike back to some degree. You need to save face domestically and internationally, reestablish deterrence. On the other hand, you don't necessarily want to get into a full-scale war with the United States, the greatest superpower on Earth, the one country on Earth that could lead to the complete destruction of your military and the end of your regime. And so my assessment and the assessment of most Iran military analysts who've looked at this say that the supreme leader would likely choose some kind of calibrated response. So he'd strike back a little bit, but try not to go so far that would provoke a U.S. Major conflict with the United States. And so what I argue in the book is that we can play on those fears and kind of have an intra-war deterrence where we make it clear to Iran that if they engage in actions that we'd find unacceptable, use of chemical and biological weapons, closing the Strait of Hormuz, sponsor a major terrorist attack in the United States, that at that point we would be willing to retaliate in a bigger way, but that as long as they fall short of those red lines, that we're only interested in destroying the nuclear facilities. This isn't a war against the regime or against the country writ large. And I think with that kind of strategy, I think it's certain that we'd have to accept and absorb limited Iranian military retaliation, which wouldn't be pleasant, but that I think we can deter the worst retaliatory options. So many people have argued that this would somehow become World War III or a wider regional war, and it's just really hard to see how that, it's really hard to spin that story and to see how it becomes a regional war. And again, something I talk about more in the book, about the likely Iranian courses of response, how we could deal with it. Another thing I talk about is that restraining Israel, I think, is a key part. Because if Israel then itself retaliates against Iran because of Iranian retaliation against Israel, then I think that is one pathway by which you can see this becoming a wider conflict. So I think part of our strategy going in would have to be to go to Israel beforehand and strike a deal and say, we're going to take care of Iran's nuclear program, something that you say is the greatest threat to your national security. In response, you have to agree to stay on the sidelines and absorb Iranian retaliation. And I think that is a deal we could strike. We essentially struck the same deal in the Persian Gulf War. Israel accepted Scud missile attacks from Saddam Hussein and stayed on the sidelines. Again, the Iranian military retaliation, it's a serious consequence, and I don't want to downplay it, but I think that it's also something that we would attempt to manage.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Kevin Chafee, MSL Corvus Group. There are more Iranian people of Iranian descent living in the United States than any place else besides Iran. And they would range from those who would like to see the Pahlavi dynasty back on the throne to people who grew less enchanted with the current regime not so long ago. So I'm wondering if you have any idea of how these admittedly disparate groups would feel about your proposals.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have many Iranian American friends and colleagues and have a number of discussions with them. And it seems like, as you point out, they're all across the spectrum. Some of them are most supportive of military action and, in fact, are much more hawkish than I am, would prefer a much larger force package that would topple this regime and bring some other kind of new government to power. Others on the complete opposite end of the spectrum and think that the entire conflict is artificial and that the United States doesn't really care about nuclear weapons and that we just have some kind of deep-seated hatred against Iran, and if it wasn't nuclear weapons, we'd be fighting over something else. So I think it's hard to generalize. Same with, I guess, Americans in general. Many more hawkish than I am, many more dovish. But yeah, good question.
Yeah, this gentleman in the back.
Bob McNally with a Rapidan Group energy consulting firm. Matt, if you could play the analyst role here a little bit. We've talked about what the president's policy is, or stated policy. We've talked about what the American people may think if the president decides it's time to attack. We've talked about what the Iranians residing here may think. How would you characterize the senior U.S. defense and foreign policy establishment and the advisors who the president would be asking for their view if we came to that point? Is it monolithic? Does it tip one way or the other? But let's say we're in that contain or attack scenario. How do you see the establishment coming out on that question? Thank you.
Good question. And thanks for coming, Bob. I mentioned Bob's work earlier. He's one of the people who's done some good analysis on the possible economic consequences of a strike or of deterrence and containment. So, there are people in the administration and in high levels who were on the record beforehand as being fairly soft on Iran. And so their voices would be heard. This is an administration that has centralized foreign policy to a degree that we haven't seen in a while. Talked to some of my friends about how there are directors at the White House who are really micromanaging deputy assistant secretaries and assistant secretaries. So I think that there are disadvantages to that, but I think one advantage of that is that this administration has been able to, the president's preferences and the White House's staff's preferences on some of the most important national security challenges have been won the day. And so again, the president's closest advisors at the White House, like Ross, like Seymour, others I've talked to, say matter-of-factly that the president says the same thing in the Oval Office that he says in public, that he really wants to solve this diplomatically, that he doesn't want to have to get to that point, but that Iran's not going to get nuclear weapons, and if it comes to that point, that he would be willing to use force. So it's what he says, it's what his closest advisors say. I guess I take him. Now, I know that there are very few people outside of maybe me and these advisors who believe it. I know most people in the Beltway, in the country, overseas, don't believe him. And I think that's possibly the worst possible combination, because it gets you into potentially a conflict that you could have avoided. If he's serious about using force and nobody believes that, then Iran might go ahead and push ahead and cross those red lines and lead to a conflict. So I think there are a number of things that the president could do and probably should do to increase his credibility on this issue, and I talk about some of those things in the book. I think if this round of diplomacy collapses, setting clear red lines, what are the advances in Iran's nuclear program that would trigger a military response, I think it would make sense to be clear about that. I don't see any advantage to keeping that to himself. I think there are other things that other actors in the U.S. government could do as well. Again, if this round of diplomacy collapses, I think Congress could authorize the use of military force. That would help to increase his credibility. And then I think also engaging in more visible outreach with our friends and partners. Again, if this round of diplomacy collapses, going to NATO, talking to the Brits, to our other close allies, explaining our position, getting a public show of support from them that this is the way that we would head. I think all of those things could help to increase the credibility of our threat. And then, of course, as the Romans said, if you want peace, prepare for war. I think if it becomes clear to the Iranians that we are serious, it's actually something that could get them back to the negotiating table. Because if the supreme leader has a choice of fighting a war with the country he calls the Great Satan, or striking a deal with the country, a deal he doesn't really want with the Great Satan, he might just make a deal with the devil. So.
We have time for a couple more questions, so why don't we do one here and one there. Here comes the mic. Hold on, here comes the microphone. If you could identify yourself. Too. Thanks.
Markus Pinder, German National Public Radio. How do you judge the president's credibility in terms of foreign policy after what he did in Syria? Didn't that harm his potential to scare Iran into a more palatable negotiation position?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we have a major credibility problem because of Syria. And I don't think anybody really disagrees with that. I think the debate is more on, was it a mistake to make the red line in the first place, or was it a mistake not to follow through on it? But I think everyone realizes there was a problem. We took a major hit with our credibility. I had a friend who just recently went to Asia and was talking to allies in South Korea and Japan. And she said she was shocked at how quickly Syria came up in the conversation. So they said, what does this mean for us? The president set a red line, he didn't follow through on it. What does it mean for the U.S. Defense Pact in Seoul and Tokyo? Does that mean that we can't count on the United States anymore? And this person quickly pointed out, well, there's a formal defense arrangement there. There wasn't one in Syria. But still, I think the perception is there. So I don't think that the president's word is enough. That's why I think some of these other things I've talked about would be needed to increase the credibility of our threat. Essentially just taking the steps that we would need to take if we were going to go down this route. Clearly state what the red lines are, go to Congress, outreach with allies. And I think these are things that could help increase the credibility. But right now we do have a credibility problem. And as I pointed out before, I think it's the president and his closest advisors, and now me, who believe that he's serious about using force. And I think many other people don't buy it.
Hi, Gary Sargent, Treadstone Light. I'm an independent consultant, former Army officer, and I was a planner during 9/11 at the Pentagon at some point. So my thing is prior to 9/11, we had a box for Iraq. It was called Northern Watch and some other things. And we basically, destroyed air defense systems, shot down aircraft, did relatively limited strikes for, 10 years? And all day long, that was cheaper than our war in Iraq. And I'd make the case that I'm in sort of agreement with you, so I sort of wanted to see what is your point, and have you done that comparison, and it may be in your book, but that comparison of costs, because I think it's a fallacy when people say how much a strike on Iran is going to cost, because I think you can keep it in the box all day long.
Yeah. So this gets back to Barry's question a little bit, and Barry, your estimate, what it was, $700 billion for a strike?
It's one that I saw.
Yeah. So I haven't seen that assessment. I would want to go into that, but that seems high to me, I think. And again, it depends a lot on what the consequences of this looks like. It's conceivable that it's a strike on Iranian air defenses and 4 nuclear facilities. Iran engages in limited retaliation and it dies down. Or it's possible that Iran retaliates in a big way, Israel retaliates, it becomes a broader conflict. We feel Iran goes too far, we feel like we have to escalate, go against other Iranian military assets or other things in which it would become a bigger conflict. But either way, we're talking about numbers. These aren't Iraq and Afghanistan style options that are being considered here. Nobody's talking about invading the country. Nobody's talking about overthrowing the government. Nobody's talking about putting 100,000 troops. Nobody's talking about staying for 10 years. So it is much more of a Libya-style operation, or the kind of operation that was envisioned in Syria. Many people want to turn to the Iraq and Afghanistan invasion scenarios, but that's very misleading.
Okay. If there's one more question, we can take that. Otherwise, there's some beverages and refreshments outside. And also, please join me in thanking our speaker today.